On September 1st, 1939, when German tanks rolled across the Polish border, approximately 2 billion people lived on Earth. Within 6 years, between 70 and 85 million of them would be dead, representing roughly 3% of the global population. However, this is not a story about death. This is a story about life. It is about how ordinary people survived, suffered, adapted, and endured during humanity's darkest hour. It is about the small details of existence that history books often overlook. It is about what people ate for breakfast, how they kept warm in winter, where they slept during bombing raids, and how they found reasons to hope when the world seemed to be ending. World War II was not just fought on battlefields by soldiers with rifles and tanks. It was fought every single day in kitchens, where mothers tried to stretch a week's rations into 10 days of meals. It was fought in damp basements, where families huddled together during air raids, listening to bombs fall on their neighborhoods. It was fought in factories where women worked 16-hour shifts, making ammunition and aircraft parts. It was fought in endless bread lines where people stood for hours hoping to buy a loaf of bread. It was fought in black markets where desperate people traded family heirlooms for a few eggs. It was fought in victory gardens where families grew vegetables in every available patch of earth. It was fought in the human heart's remarkable capacity to find hope and maintain dignity even when hope seemed like a foolish luxury. This is their story. This is the story of the poor, who had almost nothing before the war and lost even that little bit. This is the story of the middle class, who saw their comfortable lives shattered and had to learn entirely new ways of living. This is the story of the wealthy, who sometimes managed to maintain their privileges while others starved, and who sometimes lost everything they had built over generations. This is the story of what people actually ate, how they truly lived day by day, and how they managed to survive when the entire world seemed to be burning down around them. The East End of London, 1940-1941. Martha Williamson was 43 years old when the war began in September 1939. She lived in Stepney, which was located in London's East End, in a 2-room flat with her husband Albert, who worked at the docks, loading and unloading ships. Their 4 children, whose ages ranged from 6 to 15, and her elderly mother, who was in her 70s. The flat was located on the 2nd floor of a building that had been constructed in the Victorian era and had never been modernized. There was no indoor bathroom or toilet in the flat. Instead, they shared a single outdoor toilet located in the yard behind the building with 3 other families. This meant that in the middle of winter nights, they had to go outside into the cold and darkness to use the facilities. Water came from a single cold tap in the tiny kitchen. There was no hot running water at all. If they wanted hot water for washing or cooking, they had to heat it on the stove. The walls of the flat were thin and poorly insulated, so damp seeped through during the winter months, creating patches of mold that Martha constantly tried to scrub away. The windows rattled when the wind blew, and cold air came through the gaps around the frames. Before the war began, life for the Williamson family was hard, but it was manageable in its own way. Albert earned £3 per week at the docks, which was considered a decent wage for a manual labourer in that time and place. The rent for their flat was 12 shillings weekly, which they paid to their landlord every Friday evening. This left them with about £2 and 8 shillings for everything else they needed: food, clothing, coal for heating, gas for the stove, and any other expenses that came up. They ate simply but adequately. Their meals consisted mainly of bread, which was cheap and filling, potatoes in various forms, and cheap cuts of meat once or twice a week if they were fortunate. They drank tea with condensed milk because fresh milk was expensive and went bad quickly in their flat, which had no refrigeration. The children went to school barefoot during the summer months in order to save their shoes for winter when they really needed them. They wore hand-me-down clothes that were passed from older children to younger ones, with Martha constantly mending tears, darning socks, and sewing patches over worn spots. Nothing was ever thrown away if it could possibly be repaired and used again. When war came in September 1939, everything changed virtually overnight, though the full impact took some months to be felt. The government immediately began preparing for rationing and other restrictions. Families were issued gas masks that they were supposed to carry everywhere. Windows had to be covered with blackout curtains so that no light showed at night, making it harder for German bombers to find their targets. Street lights were turned off. Car headlights were covered except for tiny slits. The entire country was plunged into darkness every night. Rationing begins, January 1940. On January 8, 1940, food rationing officially began throughout Britain. Every person in the country, from babies to elderly people, received a ration book. These books contained coupons for specific foods. When you bought rationed food, the shopkeeper would cut out or stamp the appropriate coupon from your book. Once your coupons for a particular item were used up, you could not buy any more of that item until the next ration period began, regardless of how much money you had. This was the government's way of ensuring that everyone, rich and poor, received a fair share of the limited food supplies available. The government wanted to prevent the wealthy from buying up everything while the poor starved, which is what had happened during World War I. The weekly rations that each person was allowed were severely limited and represented a dramatic reduction in what people had been accustomed to eating. Each person was allowed 4 ounces of bacon or ham per week, which translated to roughly 4 thin slices. They received 2 ounces of butter, which was barely enough to spread on toast for a few days if you spread it very thinly. Sugar was rationed to 8 ounces per week, which had to cover sweetening tea, any baking you did, and making jam if you had fruit. Meat was allocated based on its price rather than its weight, with each person receiving 1 shilling and 2 pence worth per week, which translated to about 1 pound of the cheapest cuts of meat, often organ meats that most people found unappetizing. Tea, which was absolutely essential to British culture and was considered vital for morale, was limited to 2 ounces per week, which was just enough to make about 2 cups per day if you made it weak and reused the leaves. Cheese was rationed to just 2 ounces per week, barely enough for a couple of thin sandwiches. Margarine, which was used as a butter substitute, was 4 ounces per week. Cooking fat, needed for frying, was only 2 ounces per week. Milk was limited to 3 pints per week for adults, though children, expectant mothers, and nursing mothers received more. Eggs were initially 1 per person per week, but as the war continued and supplies became even tighter, this was reduced to 1 egg every 2 weeks, and sometimes there were no eggs available at all for weeks at a time. For a family like the Williamsons, with 7 people to feed, including 2 growing teenage boys who were always hungry, this meant catastrophically little food. The official rations provided only about 1,500 to 2,000 calories per day, but Albert needed at least 3,000 calories per day for his physically demanding work at the docks, and the growing children needed substantial amounts of food for their development. The adults, particularly Martha, often gave portions of their food to the children, going hungry themselves so their children could eat. Martha learned through bitter necessity and constant experimentation to make meals from almost nothing, stretching every ingredient through creativity, careful planning, and sometimes sheer desperation. A typical day's menu in the Williamson household during the winter of 1941 looked like this, and it was repeated with only minor variations day after day after day. For breakfast, they ate bread, which was often stale by the time they got to eat it, because they had to make a loaf last several days. Martha would toast the stale bread to make it more palatable and to hide its age. She spread it with a thin scraping of margarine, spread so thinly that you could almost see through it to the bread beneath. They drank tea that was made weak to make it last longer, with a tiny bit of condensed milk added, because fresh milk was reserved for the children to drink on its own. On lucky days, when Martha had managed to obtain oatmeal, they had porridge for breakfast. She made it with water rather than milk, to conserve their milk ration, and she added extra water to stretch the oatmeal further, making it thin and watery, but at least filling their stomachs with something warm. For lunch, which working-class families called dinner, because it was traditionally the main meal of the day in earlier times, they typically had potato soup. Martha made this by boiling potatoes in water with onions, if she had managed to find any, salt if they had any left, and dried herbs that she had saved from the previous summer or bought when available. This soup was very thin, more like potato-flavored water with chunks of potato floating in it. They ate this soup with bread. Perhaps a small piece of cheese about the size of a domino would be carefully cut into 7 even smaller pieces and divided among the children, with the adults going without. For supper, which they called tea, they had more bread, this time with dripping if they had any. Dripping was the fat and meat juices that dripped from the Sunday roast into the pan beneath. Martha carefully saved this, let it cool and solidify, and then stored it in a jar. Throughout the week, they would spread it on bread, using it as both fat and flavoring. They also ate boiled vegetables with their tea. These vegetables were usually carrots, turnips, and cabbage, which were often the only foods available without needing ration coupons, because they were produced in Britain. Martha boiled them until they were very soft, sometimes even mushy, because that was how people cooked vegetables then, and also because it made them easier to digest when people's stomachs were weakened by insufficient food. They drank more tea, again made weak to conserve their tea ration. Sunday was considered the best day of the week in terms of food, though even Sunday meals were meagre by pre-war standards. They would have a small piece of meat, often organ meats like liver, kidneys, or tripe, which most people found less desirable than regular cuts of meat, and which therefore required fewer ration points to purchase. Martha would make this into a stew by cutting the meat into small pieces and cooking it slowly with whatever vegetables she could get and potatoes to bulk it out. The bones from this Sunday meal were absolutely never thrown away. Instead, Martha would boil them repeatedly throughout the following week, adding water each time to make thin broths that provided at least some flavor and a tiny amount of nutrition to their other meals. She would boil the same bones 4 or 5 times until they literally fell apart and there was nothing left to extract from them. The Blitz, September 1940 to May 1941. On September 7th, 1940, the German Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force, began what came to be known as the Blitz. This was a sustained campaign of bombing British cities that would continue for 8 months, ending in May 1941. The East End of London, with its docks, warehouses, factories, and working-class neighbourhoods, was hit particularly hard because the docks were a strategic target for the Germans. They wanted to destroy Britain's ability to receive supplies by ship. However, the surrounding neighbourhoods, where the dock workers and their families lived, suffered terribly from the bombing intended for the docks. The Williamsons' lives became entirely ruled by the air raid siren, that wailing sound that became the soundtrack of their existence during those months. The sound of that siren, rising and falling, could be heard across the entire city. When it sounded, you had perhaps 15 minutes, maybe 20 if you were very lucky, to get to a shelter before the bombers arrived overhead and began dropping their deadly cargo. A typical night during the Blitz unfolded in a pattern that became grimly familiar to the Williamson family and millions of others. At 6 o'clock in the evening, just as darkness was falling, the air raid siren would begin its wailing. The sound started low and rose to a high pitch, then fell again, repeating over and over. Everyone knew exactly what it meant. The Germans were coming. At 5 minutes past 6, Martha would grab the emergency bag that she kept packed by the door at all times. This bag contained their ration books, which were literally more valuable than money, because without them, you could not buy food, even if you had cash. It also contained their identity cards, which everyone was required to carry. She packed a bottle of water because you never knew how long you might be in the shelter. She included a loaf of bread if they had one, because hunger did not stop during air raids. She packed a blanket because the shelters were always cold and damp. Sometimes she managed to include a book or a pack of cards to help pass the long hours underground. The children were already dressed because they had learned to sleep fully clothed, ready to run at a moment's notice. At first, this had seemed strange and uncomfortable, but now it was normal. They kept their clothes on, including their shoes, because there might not be time to dress if the sirens sounded in the middle of the night. At 10 minutes past 6, the entire family would rush out of their flat, down the stairs, and into the street, joining streams of other families all hurrying toward the nearest public shelter. The shelter they used was located 3 streets away. It was a damp, dark tunnel that had been reinforced with concrete and sandbags. The shelter was designed to hold perhaps 100 people, but during the Blitz, 300 or more would cram inside because people were desperate for any protection from the bombs falling from the sky. Families tried to claim the same spots each time, spreading newspapers or thin blankets on the concrete floor to sit on. Some lucky people had folding chairs that they brought with them. Most people sat or lay on the floor. The air inside the shelter was thick and foul-smelling. It reeked of urine because the toilet facilities were totally inadequate for the number of people using them. It smelled of unwashed bodies because people had no facilities to bathe properly, and soap was strictly rationed. It smelled of fear, which is a real smell, the smell of hundreds of people sweating despite the cold because they were terrified. At 6:30, the bombing would begin. They could hear it even through the thick walls of the shelter. The first sound was the drone of the German bombers' engines, a deep, throbbing sound that seemed to fill the air. Then came the whistling sound of bombs falling, a sound that started high and dropped lower as the bomb fell faster and faster toward the ground. Then came the explosions, enormous crashes that shook the ground beneath them. The shelter would shake with each explosion. Dust and small pieces of concrete would fall from the ceiling, getting in their eyes, their hair, their mouths. The single electric light bulb that provided illumination would swing wildly on its cord, casting crazy shadows on the walls. Somewhere in the darkness of the crowded shelter, a woman would pray aloud, her voice rising and falling with religious verses. Children would cry, frightened by the terrible sounds and the shaking earth. Mothers would try to comfort them, holding them close, covering their ears with their hands. Albert would hold 6-year-old Tommy tightly, and Tommy would press his hands over his ears as hard as he could, trying desperately to block out the sounds of the bombs exploding above them. The explosions came in waves, sometimes close enough that it felt like the entire shelter would collapse on top of them, sometimes farther away, but still terrifyingly loud. At 1:45, after more than 6 hours underground, the all-clear siren would finally sound. Its steady, continuous tone was so different from the rising and falling wail of the warning siren. This steady tone meant the bombers had gone, at least for now. The family would emerge from the shelter, blinking in the darkness of the blackout, their eyes taking time to adjust. They would look around at their neighborhood, never knowing what they would see. On this particular night, 3 buildings on their street were now nothing but piles of rubble, broken bricks and splintered wood, where homes had stood just hours before. The Johnsons' house, a neat little terraced house, where the family had shared tea just the previous afternoon, was completely gone. It had been reduced to rubble by a direct hit. Mrs. Johnson and her 2 daughters, aged 8 and 11, were dead, crushed under tons of collapsed masonry. Rescue workers with shovels and bare hands were still digging frantically through the debris, but everyone knew it was hopeless. No one could have survived under all that weight. At midnight, the Williamson family returned to their flat, which had miraculously survived another night intact. They tried to sleep in their clothes on their beds, but sleep was difficult. Their nerves were frayed, their hearts still racing with adrenaline. They jumped at every sound, wondering if it was another bomber, and they knew that the sirens might sound again in just a few hours, starting the whole terrible process over again. Sometimes the sirens did sound again. Sometimes families spent entire nights in the shelter, emerging at dawn exhausted and traumatized. This happened night after night after night for 8 months. For 8 months, this was their life, this constant cycle of fear, bombing and relief, only to have it start again the next evening. Making dough, the survival strategies of poor families. The official rations that the government provided were simply not enough to survive on, and the government knew this perfectly well. The rations were calculated to prevent outright starvation, but they provided only about 1,500 to 2,000 calories per day, depending on age and occupation. Manual laborers like Albert needed 3,000 calories or more per day to maintain their strength for the demanding physical work they did. Children needed proper nutrition to grow and develop normally. Pregnant and nursing women needed extra food. So poor families like the Williamsons developed various strategies to supplement their official rations, to find extra food wherever they could, and to make what they had stretch as far as possible. Martha spent hours and hours every single day standing in queues, which British people called queuing. Queuing became essentially a part-time job for women during the war. When word spread through the neighborhood that a particular shop had received a shipment of oranges or onions or any item that was not rationed but was in short supply, women would immediately drop whatever they were doing and rush to form a queue outside that shop. They would stand for hours, sometimes in the rain or bitter cold, just hoping that the supply would last until they reached the front of the line. Many times, women queued, not even knowing what the shop had received. They would see a queue forming and join it, figuring that if other women were queuing, there must be something worth having. Sometimes they would stand for 2 or 3 hours, only to discover that the shop had received something they could not use or already had, but they would buy it anyway, because you never knew when you might need it for trading with neighbors. One woman who lived through this time and was interviewed many years later remembered her experiences vividly. She said that she once stood in a queue outside a greengrocer's shop for 2 solid hours in the rain. Her feet were cold and wet because her shoes had holes in them that she had stuffed with newspaper. Her back ached from standing. When she finally reached the front of the queue, after all that waiting, she discovered that the shop had received only carrots, nothing but carrots. She already had carrots at home that she had grown in her victory garden, but she bought the carrots anyway, spending money she could barely afford, because, as she explained, you never knew when you would see vegetables again in the shops. Things appeared and disappeared unpredictably. If you did not buy something when you had the chance, it might be weeks or months before you saw it again. So you bought whatever was available whenever it was available, whether you needed it right then or not. Every single scrap of land throughout Britain was planted with vegetables as part of a government campaign called Dig for Victory. Parks, playing fields, the grounds of stately homes, gardens, even the moat of the Tower of London, all were dug up and planted with food crops. The Williamsons had no garden because they lived in a flat, but they rented what was called an allotment. An allotment was a small plot of land, usually located on the outskirts of the city, where families could grow their own food. The Williamsons' allotment was about the size of a large room, perhaps 20 feet by 30 feet. On Sundays, when Albert did not have to work at the docks, the entire family would take the bus, spending precious pennies on fares, to travel to their allotment. The journey took about an hour each way, and the work was hard, especially for people who were already weakened by insufficient food and lack of sleep. But the vegetables they grew made an enormous difference to their survival. They grew potatoes as their main crop, because potatoes were the most filling and nutritious of vegetables, and because they could be stored through the winter in a cool, dark place. They grew carrots because the Ministry of Food promoted them heavily in propaganda campaigns, even claiming falsely that carrots helped you see in the dark during blackouts. In reality, this was a story invented to hide the fact that British pilots were using radar to find German planes at night. They grew cabbages, which were hardy and productive. They grew turnips, which most people found rather tasteless, but which filled stomachs. They grew beans, which provided valuable protein. These vegetables supplemented their rations significantly and sometimes provided extra produce that could be traded with neighbors. A bucket of potatoes might be traded for a jar of preserved fruit that a neighbor had managed to make, or for a bit of wool for knitting, or for any number of other things people needed. The black market was illegal, and the government prosecuted people who were caught using it, but it was widespread throughout Britain during the war. Dock workers like Albert sometimes found items that had mysteriously fallen off ships during the loading or unloading process. These items might include tins of meat, chocolate, silk stockings, coffee, tea, or other luxuries and necessities. These items could be traded for other goods that the family needed or sold for cash to people who had money. A black market economy developed throughout Britain with its own price structure that was dramatically higher than the official government-controlled prices. 1 pound of butter cost 5 shillings on the black market, compared to the official price of 1 shilling and 4 pence, nearly 4 times more expensive. 1 pound of tea cost 15 shillings on the black market, compared to the official price of 2 shillings and 8 pence, more than 5 times the official price. 1 egg cost 6 pence on the black market, but eggs could not be bought at any price in regular shops, because they were so strictly rationed. A pair of silk stockings could cost 1 pound on the black market, compared to the official price of 3 shillings. But silk stockings were simply not available in shops at any price, because silk was needed for parachutes. Using the black market was risky. The government wanted to prevent black market trading because it undermined the rationing system and meant that those with money could get more than their fair share while others went without. People who were caught buying or selling black market goods were prosecuted and fined. Some were even sent to prison, though this was rare for buyers, more common for sellers. But when your children were hungry, when you watched them growing thinner and more listless day by day, when you saw them becoming weak and susceptible to every illness that came along, you took the risk. Martha would never have called herself a criminal. She was a respectable woman who went to church when she could and tried to live honestly. But she bought black market goods whenever she could afford them and whenever the opportunity arose, because her children's survival was more important than obeying every law. New clothes were almost impossible to obtain during the war. Clothing was rationed just as strictly as food was. Each person in Britain received 60 coupons per year for clothing. These coupons had to cover all your clothing needs for the entire year. A man's coat required 18 coupons, using up nearly a third of your annual allowance with a single purchase. A woman's dress required 11 coupons. A pair of shoes required 7 coupons for adults, 3 for children. A man's suit required 26 coupons. A pair of stockings required 2 coupons. This meant that buying 1 winter coat and 1 pair of shoes would use up nearly half your annual coupon allowance, leaving precious little for anything else. Martha became an expert at what was called making over, which meant taking apart old garments and reusing the fabric to create something new or to repair something else. She would carefully unpick the seams of old dresses that were worn out or had gone out of fashion, separate all the pieces, iron them flat, and then use the fabric to make clothes for her children. She cut down Albert's old shirts, which were worn out under the arms and around the collar, to make shirts for the boys. She cut worn sheets down the middle lengthwise where they were thinnest from years of use, then sewed the outer edges together in the middle, effectively turning the sheet inside out and creating what appeared to be a nearly new sheet with the worn part now on the outer edges. She darned socks, which meant carefully weaving thread back and forth across holes to repair them, until the socks were more darning than original sock, more repair than original fabric. When shoes developed holes in the soles, a common problem, because shoe leather was of poor quality during the war, she stuffed the holes with cardboard cut from boxes or with newspaper to try to keep her children's feet dry. The government promoted a campaign with the slogan, "Make do and mend." Posters showed cheerful women happily sewing and knitting. For the middle class, this represented a patriotic sacrifice, a way of contributing to the war effort. For the poor like the Williamsons, this was not a voluntary choice or a patriotic gesture. This was exactly how they had always lived, how they had survived even before the war. But now, It was even harder because there were fewer materials available and everything was more expensive. Health and hygiene among the poor. During wartime, living conditions for poor families deteriorated dramatically during the war years, affecting their health in numerous ways. Sanitation became increasingly difficult to maintain. Hot water was scarce because fuel for heating water was strictly rationed. Coal, which most people used for heating water and for heating their homes, was rationed tightly because so much was needed for industry and for the war effort. Baths were officially limited to 5 inches of water by government order in an effort to conserve fuel. Many families went weeks without proper baths, making do with what they called a strip wash, which meant standing in front of a basin of cold water and washing their bodies piece by piece with a cloth. Soap was rationed to 4 ounces per person per month. This small amount of soap had to cover washing bodies, washing hair, washing clothes, and washing dishes. It was nowhere near enough for all these purposes. Women learned to make soap stretch by cutting bars into smaller pieces so it seemed like they had more. They saved every sliver of soap, collecting the small pieces in a jar and melting them together to make new bars. They used soap substitutes like soda crystals when they could obtain them, though these were harsh on skin and fabric. Disease spread easily in these unsanitary conditions. Overcrowding in air raid shelters created perfect conditions for tuberculosis to spread rapidly through the population. Tuberculosis, which primarily affects the lungs, spreads through the air when infected people cough or sneeze. In crowded shelters where hundreds of people were packed together for hours every night, breathing the same air, tuberculosis spread quickly. Cases of tuberculosis increased significantly during the war years. Scabies, a highly contagious skin condition caused by microscopic mites that burrow under the skin, became epidemic in crowded shelters. The mites cause intense itching that becomes worse at night. People scratched until they bled, and the scratching often led to secondary infections. Impetigo, a bacterial skin infection that causes crusty sores, spread easily among children living in close quarters with poor hygiene. Lice became a constant, humiliating problem for poor families during the war. Head lice, body lice, and pubic lice all thrived in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. These tiny parasitic insects live on the human body and feed on blood, causing itching and discomfort. Mothers spent hours checking their children's hair with fine-tooth combs, carefully going through section by section, picking out the tiny insects and their eggs, called nits, which stick to the hair shaft. Some mothers cut their children's hair very short or even shaved their heads completely to make dealing with lice easier. There was tremendous shame attached to having lice, even though in those conditions it was nearly unavoidable. Children with lice were sometimes excluded from school or made to feel dirty and inferior. Dental health suffered terribly during the war years. Toothbrushes wore out and could not be replaced because they were not considered essential items. Toothpaste was not rationed, but it was often unavailable in shops for weeks or months at a time. People made do with baking soda or salt to clean their teeth when they could get these items, but many people simply stopped brushing their teeth regularly because they had nothing to brush with. Dental decay increased dramatically, especially among children. Sugar was rationed, which might have helped prevent tooth decay, but the overall poor nutrition meant that children's teeth developed poorly in the first place. Dentists were in short supply because many had joined the military, and dental care was expensive, so poor families simply endured toothaches and lost teeth. Mental health was perhaps the greatest invisible casualty of the war, though people did not talk about it in those terms then. The constant fear that people lived with every single day took a terrible toll. The lack of sleep from spending nights in shelters or being woken by air raid sirens affected everyone's mental state. The grief of losing neighbors, friends, and family members in bombing raids was overwhelming. The constant anxiety about loved ones who were away fighting in the military, not knowing if they were alive or dead, was agonizing. Martha developed what we would now recognize and diagnose as an anxiety disorder, though no one called it that then. She jumped at sudden noises, her heart racing with fear. She had nightmares about being trapped in collapsed buildings, unable to breathe, with rubble crushing her. She snapped at her children over small things, her temper frayed by constant stress and exhaustion. Many people drank more heavily during the war, seeking temporary escape in alcohol, which, despite all the shortages and rationing, was often more easily available than food. Children suffered in particular ways from the war. They missed months or even years of school when school buildings were bombed, or when they were evacuated to the countryside. They saw terrible things that no child should see: corpses lying in the streets, injured people screaming in pain, buildings burning, destruction all around them. Many children were evacuated to the countryside, separated from their parents for years, living with strangers who sometimes treated them kindly and sometimes treated them as unwanted burdens. Tommy, the youngest Williamson child, developed a stutter that would last his entire life as a result of the trauma of the war. He wet the bed until he was 10 years old, long past the age when this should have stopped. Martha understood that this was from fear and stress, not from laziness or defiance, but she could not fix it. She could only try to protect him as much as possible and hope that someday peace would return.